On a sweltering July evening in 1991, Flagstaff, Arizona, found itself shrouded in an eerie silence that few could explain. It was the kind of night where the oppressive heat hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe, and yet the town's inhabitants were left with an unsettling sense of dread that crept over them like the setting sun, casting long shadows over the desert. The events that would unfold that night would scar the community for years to come. At first, it seemed like just another tragic accident. 4 college girls were discovered in a secluded part of the woods, each one of them brutally murdered. Their bodies were contorted, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles, and blood was smeared across the forest floor in chilling patterns. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town, but it was the way the authorities responded that made the story linger in every whispered conversation. The primary suspect in the case, a man named Roland Allred, was arrested within hours of the bodies being found. Allred, a former boyfriend of one of the victims, had a history of violence and was known for his volatile temper. His arrest seemed like an open and shut case. The town was convinced they had their killer, but something about the whole situation felt off. As investigators dug deeper, however, something strange began to surface. A chilling and unexpected twist emerged when the ex-girlfriend of Roland Allred, the victim who had been closest to him, came forward with a startling claim. She had been terrified in the days leading up to her death. She had told her friends and family that her former boyfriend was not the one to blame for the murders. No, she believed it was something far darker, a creature, something inhuman. She whispered about a werewolf. Her final words before her death were reportedly cryptic. It wasn't him. It wasn't Roland. It was something else. Something. I saw it. The authorities were quick to dismiss the notion as the ramblings of a scared young woman, perhaps under stress, but the claim hung in the air like a curse. Could a werewolf have been responsible for such savagery? Or was this just the desperate cry of a woman who couldn't face the truth of her own demise? As the investigation continued, the question of whether the murders were the result of a human or something more primal weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Roland Allred was eventually charged with the brutal killings, yet his story, his defense, and the eerie explanation his ex-girlfriend left behind refused to die. The police had their suspect, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The case soon began to take on an even more bizarre dimension when another name emerged. Jackson Harrow, a night security guard who had worked at Crescent Moon Lake, became an important figure in the investigation. Jackson was a man whose name had already appeared in several of the bizarre reports surrounding the case. He was a person the police began to scrutinize, someone who, despite being arrested for his own involvement in a previous altercation, insisted that he knew the truth behind the murders. Jackson was not like other suspects. He was not the violent type, nor did he appear to have a direct connection to the victims. He was, however, a man with a troubled past. He had been working at Crescent Moon Lake on the night of the murders, and in the days following, his story began to take on an increasingly strange quality. He insisted that the murders were not the work of a human being, but of something more monstrous. He claimed that he had encountered the very creature responsible for the deaths of the 4 girls. Jackson's story was one that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. He had been on his regular shift that night, patrolling the grounds of Crescent Moon Lake, a remote and notoriously eerie place. Jackson spoke of an overwhelming pain, a sensation like no other. He described it as if his flesh was being torn apart from within. It was an agonizing experience, one that left him crippled with terror, unable to move. The pain was so intense that he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath before everything went black. When he came to, Jackson was disoriented and frightened, but the sight that awaited him was beyond his comprehension. He had heard the growl, the low, guttural rumble that vibrated in his chest. Then he had seen it, an enormous creature standing tall against the night sky, its eyes glowing a menacing amber. Jackson's heart raced as he described the creature that attacked him, a beast unlike anything he had ever seen. He had never believed in supernatural forces, but in that moment, he said, all his beliefs shattered. The creature's features were impossible to describe fully. a blur of claws, teeth, and fur. But the worst part was the undeniable sense of malevolence that radiated from it. Jackson insisted it wasn't human. Its size, its speed, its power, and the way it moved all pointed to something far beyond ordinary comprehension. It was not just an animal, but something more. The theory that the murders were committed by this creature, the very werewolf his ex-girlfriend had mentioned, consumed him. By the time the police had arrived at the lake, Jackson was too injured to be of any use. They dismissed his account as the ramblings of a man who had experienced a hallucination brought on by the trauma. Still, Jackson held firm to his belief, and it was this unwavering claim that would lead him down a dark path. He was arrested shortly after, charged with involvement in the murders, though no direct evidence could tie him to the crime scene. Still, his strange insistence on the supernatural was enough to have him confined to a mental hospital where he would spend the rest of his life. The line between sanity and madness became increasingly difficult to distinguish as Jackson's story began to consume his every thought. Was he a victim of a monstrous force, or had he become a man haunted by his own delusions? Jackson's life in the mental hospital became a strange, solitary existence, one where his mind, tormented by memories and visions, fractured further with each passing day. The doctors who had once believed in his sanity were now certain of his delusions. He had become a textbook case of paranoia, a man who saw monsters in the shadows, whose grip on reality had slipped entirely. But despite their assessments, Jackson continued to tell his story with unyielding conviction. He was certain of what he had witnessed that night, certain that the creature that attacked him was not merely a figment of his fractured mind, but a living, breathing nightmare. And with every retelling, his voice seemed to become a little more desperate, a little more frantic, as if he feared forgetting the details, as if the beast might fade from memory. Despite his confinement, Jackson's reputation continued to grow in the town of Flagstaff. The murders that had shocked the community years before still lingered in the collective consciousness of the town, and his bizarre claims became the stuff of local legend. People spoke of the killings in hushed tones, as if acknowledging them might bring something terrible back into the world. The idea of a werewolf, of something beyond the natural world having committed such horrors, was too much to dismiss entirely, even if most of the town had moved on from it. Jackson, however, was trapped in the past, and the more he spoke of the creature, the more the lines between his personal history and the investigation blurred. His narrative became as much about the murders as it was about his own tortured soul. But it was a conversation one evening with a new psychiatrist that would alter Jackson's fate. Dr. Amelia Winters, a seasoned professional who had dealt with patients similar to Jackson in the past, was assigned to his case. She was skeptical of his claims at first, but she had seen enough in her years of practice to know that there was often more lurking beneath the surface of seemingly delusional patients. Dr. Winters approached Jackson's case with a new perspective. What if there was truth buried within the madness? She began to study his records and even conducted a few interviews where Jackson described his experience in more vivid detail than ever before. In one of these interviews, Jackson spoke of the lake, the Crescent Moon Lake, again, his voice low, almost reverent. It wasn't just the pain, he whispered. It was the feeling of the earth trembling beneath me, like something was rising from it. I thought I was dying, but when I woke up, I knew that it had something to do with the land, the lake. It's cursed, Doctor. Winters. The whole place is cursed. He told her that the creature was tied to the location, a place where dark energies lingered, feeding the evil that had taken root in the land. Dr. Winters, intrigued by his descriptions, did something that no one else had dared to do. She visited Crescent Moon Lake. What she found there left her with more questions than answers. The lake, isolated and quiet, seemed to hold a certain weight to it, as if it were an ancient, forgotten place where the world itself had once been unmade. She couldn't shake the feeling that something watched her from the dark woods surrounding the lake. And when she returned to town, she couldn't help but wonder if Jackson had been telling the truth all along. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murders had never truly been closed, and new evidence had recently come to light. Pieces that only seemed to confirm Jackson's bizarre theory. A set of blood samples, originally thought to belong to the victims, had been re-examined under modern testing methods. To the shock of the investigators, the blood did not match any known animal or human species. It was something foreign, an anomaly. A few weeks later, a strange discovery near the lake revealed a series of claw marks gouged into the bark of a nearby tree, deep and powerful enough to suggest that something far larger than a bear or mountain lion had left them behind. The connection between the murders and the strange occurrences at Crescent Moon Lake began to gnaw at the edges of the investigation. Some officials, reluctant to entertain the notion of a supernatural killer, still couldn't shake the eerie feeling that Jackson might have known more than they had ever given him credit for. But the authorities were quick to bury the new findings, unwilling to reopen the case under such bizarre and unprovable circumstances. However, the whispers in the town grew louder. Locals started to speak of strange sightings, of figures moving through the woods at night, of shadows that didn't quite belong, of a sensation of being watched that seemed to cling to certain spots along the lake's shore. Dr. Winters, meanwhile, had become obsessed with Jackson's case. She couldn't ignore the mounting evidence, and after weeks of research, she decided to confront him with the possibility that his claims of a werewolf could be more than a delusion. When she finally met with Jackson, she found him in a state of mania. His eyes were wide, his skin pale, and his voice a hoarse whisper. "You see, don't you?" he said to her, a twisted satisfaction in his words. "You see it now. The creature's still out there, and it's waiting for its next victim." It was at that moment, in the sterile confines of the mental hospital, that Dr. Winters finally understood something Jackson had been trying to explain all along. The line between what is real and what is imagined is far thinner than we realize. Jackson had seen something that defied logic, defied everything they knew about the natural world. And as much as she hated to admit it, the evidence surrounding the case was starting to point to something far darker than anyone had been willing to consider. The murders of the 4 college girls, the strange attacks, and the inexplicable phenomena surrounding Crescent Moon Lake were no longer just a local legend. They were part of something larger. Whether it was a creature of the supernatural or something far more horrifying, the truth was out there, waiting. And Jackson Harrow, forever imprisoned by his own mind, may have been the only one who had ever truly understood it. But would anyone believe him before it was too late? The case, the town, and the very land would never be the same again. And as Dr. Winters walked away from Jackson's cell, she felt a deep, chilling fear settle within her. Perhaps the werewolf was not just a creature of myth, but a truth waiting in the darkness. The real question was, who would be next? The end, or is it?